All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. I mentioned that I've been following a handful of different true crime podcasts, and one of them that I had never checked out before was Murder Made Me Famous. And you know how like they have like suggested links and stuff, and I was able to get one of those, and I heard an episode of Murder Made Me Famous about Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and that one is of course tied to Ted Bundy. And that was actually the first way that I found out about the Green River Killer years ago by looking at the kind of they made a film about the relationship between Ted Bundy and the police. I mean, it might have even just be called like the subtitle "How I Helped Catch the Green River Killer" or something like that. I mean, that was ages ago. It's kind of a distant memory. And we might cover something about the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, in the future. But right now, at this time, I really just thought that this is kind of a valuable opportunity to just look at the commonalities between all of these different serial killers that we know in existence. And I'm not only talking about the United States of America and Canada, not only North America, but the entire world. Because does it ever just feel like when you're looking at serial killer cases that they just have overwhelming amounts of similarities and commonalities, and it's just like the same cycle going on and on and on over and over again. And I've said very clearly on this channel that if we're going to be talking about stuff like serial killers, I would hope that one of the biggest motivations is that we're kind of looking at what's going wrong with society so that, for the very least, a few people can start talking about what could we do to kind of alleviate the distress that we have going on in our world and just find out where the problem is. Okay, that's probably the easiest way to say it. I would hope that when we talk about serial killers, we're just actually trying to find out what the problem is as opposed to just kind of glorifying the work of some deranged individual. Okay, so, I was just listening to that stuff about Gary Ridgway. He was a guy who targeted prostitutes and sex workers. How many times does that happen? I mean, we see that stuff with Ted Bundy. We covered the case of Michael Ross recently. We have Robert Hansen was another one that we've covered. And it's just like so many times people are targeting not only prostitutes, but women who are in a vulnerable place. And when you hear the backstories, I mean, I'm really glad that, they're kind of starting to highlight now that there's this trope out there that serial killers are always the type that sets fires and harms animals and stuff like that, but those are not prerequisites. No, absolutely not. What I feel is a much bigger prerequisite to people who go on to become serial killers is that they are people who feel rejected from society. They seem like that they just feel like they either want to get revenge on humanity for rejecting them, particularly during their youth. Because as we see countless times, I mean, serial killers have spouses, they get married, or they have a girlfriend or fiance or something like that. They've moved on from this period of destruction, and that goes to show you that it's not only about obtaining sex. They don't just want someone in their life. They aren't just someone who is like who would be a normal person if they were able to be in an adult sexual relationship. No, absolutely not. They're someone who gets into a normal relationship and then they're like, well, what do I do with all of these feelings of anger and hatred and rejection that I had for society when I was younger? So they turn to murder. I mean, and there's no other way to say it like that. But there's no other way to say it. They turn to murder, and it's one of the ways that they get revenge on humanity and society, civilization, and especially on women. You do see some variants though of things like that. Like you have something, for example, the Zodiac Killer targeting lovers' lanes as opposed to just targeting sex workers. And that's not an isolated incident, targeting lovers' lanes. I mean, that's happened countless times. I mean, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders would be another example of that. All very similar setup. And we even mentioned one that, like, one of the things that I heard on America's Most Wanted also years ago was, like, one about, like, just like two lovers were, like, in the back seat of a car, and some guy with a mask carrying, like, not really an axe, but some type of farm tool just attacked them. And these things happen. People target, like, the couples. But that's kind of like a just sort of different dynamic. that's going on. But there's still, though, when we do examine the Zodiac killer, we still have the hatred and animosity of women. Animosity is a much better word to use rather than hatred. But a lot of people who've been talking about the Zodiac killer really believe that that's just one of the core elements, that he had a major problem with some sort of issue with the female gender. And it's like that's kind of like one of the kind of more open cases out there, because we really have less of an understanding of the Zodiac killer, because he's unnamed compared to these people like Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway and Michael Ross that we've just listed so far. But it's like you do see, though, that we've talked about animosity. That's a big thing. Rejection from society. But how about sexual tension and stuff like that? On the kind of just using sexuality as a way to mask the feelings of embarrassment and humiliation. Andrei Chikatilo from Russia is an enormous example of that. The butcher of Rostov. I believe he murdered 53 victims or something like that. But for him, like, his biggest motivation was it was a way that he could actually ejaculate during the murders, and it's like, just the act of killing somebody. And it's just one of those things. He killed for pleasure. So you definitely see that, though, that people do commit a variety of murders just solely for sexual gratification. And I mean, if that's not a consistent trend in serial killers, I don't know what else would be. Absolutely, there is a sexual aspect of this. And even if you're going to talk fiction, the show Dexter talks about that very clearly, about just kind of like, I kind of broke it down to somebody once, and I was just like, it's about having urges to kill as opposed to urges for, sexuality. The novel series for Dexter really explained it a lot more differently than the show did. Of course, it's a television show, can't really just have somebody who's not really that interested in sex, so they had to kind of bring in, different actresses and stuff and get more involved with that. But let's digress from that. That's kind of a different subject for a different channel. When we're going to be talking about the real cases, though, I mean, so many people are just asking the question, why do serial killers target prostitutes? I don't think there's much of a mystery in that. It's because they're in a very vulnerable place. They are just people who are just, they're getting in their car. And they're asking these questions during the Gary Ridgway upload on Murder Made Me Famous. They're like, how was he able to get prostitutes into his car? He had a low IQ. He wasn't really that articulate. He wasn't that smart. How was he able to get prostitutes into his car? I believe it has to do with something about paying money for sex. I mean, like, this isn't rocket science. I mean, they're just in a very vulnerable position. It's like, and that's one of the reasons why people who have this animosity toward women have a very strong opportunity to abduct them, because they're doing half the work for you. And it's like, I mean, I'd say though about serial killers, no matter who we're going to be talking about, the overwhelming majority of them learn how to hide it. And somebody kind of told this to me a couple years ago, when they're just talking about people like that. They're like, it should never really be a surprise or a mystery, or they're just like, oh, he was such a nice person. How could he have been a serial killer? What it really seems like is the thing that's going on is the person. This is just someone's got comments toward me, mind you. She was saying that something happens to them in their childhood. Most likely, they do something very bad. And then, from that moment onward, they learn how to conceal the darkness. They sort of learn how to kind of deceive people and make them think that they're a little bit more normal than they actually are. And if we're not really going to be talking about a serial killer, more of a mass shooter and a bomber, Anders Breivik from Norway, Anders Behring Breivik, someone even observed that about him as a child, saying that when he smiles, it's done kind of on the environmental issue, as opposed to it's not genuine. In other words, it's almost like he's trying to deceive people and make people think that he's actually smiling, but in reality it's just fake. It's synthetic. Mass shooters, though, if we're going to go down that road a little bit, I would say that they have kind of a different issue that's going on than the psychological features that are associated with the serial killers that are done over countless years. And we do mean countless years. We were just talking about Thug Baram on this channel from India in the 1700s and the 1800s. He could have been an active serial killer for as much as 65 years. Died when he was 75, allegedly. So it's like 65 years. These things go on for decades. Not to mention some of the more famous ones. I mean, you have things like the Zodiac Killer and the Texarkana Moonlight Murders that we mentioned. Those were very, very short, like not even a full calendar year, but the Zodiac Killer might have done other things in the state of California. Well, let's get away from that. But the difference between the serial killers and the mass shooters is it's like when someone is a mass shooter, there definitely seems to be kind of a motivation for glory, a motivation to make a name for themselves, a motivation to kind of get revenge on things like rejection from society, but definitely bullying with some of the high school shooters. What's happening a lot of the time these days is that people are turning toward mass shooting as a way to just become famous, as a way to kind of turn themselves into a sort of superstar. And someone was kind of having a discussion about this. There was a podcast called Doomed that I was listening to the other day, and they're saying what's happening now in our culture, especially coming from the United States of America as I do. People are watching the television and they see somebody murdering people in a mass shooting, and this person murdered X amount of victims, so they want to do one better. They want to kind of get a higher number when they plan their mass shooting, and that's horrendous and disgusting and despicable. But that guy's just trying to like kind of make a sort of diagnosis about what's going on in the current American culture. But what I'd say though, a commonality between mass shooters and serial killers is rejection from society. They just really have this type of they just feel like that society has pushed them out, that they are marginalized, and they're also not getting what they want from society, and they are being dominated by somebody. But when it comes to the serial killing aspect, it's an enormous amount of pressure is placed on sexuality. That's what you probably wouldn't get with mass shooters. Rejection, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the biggest things they said about Demetrio Pagortzis, the Santa Fe, Texas shooter, he said that, and the peers around him said as well that one of the motivations for that was he was rejected publicly by asking a girl out, but he did it multiple times to the point where she just lost it and kind of embarrassed him in front of everyone. But it was just kind of like a way to make him stop repetitively asking her to go out with him. So that kind of led to a mass shooting. But once again, if someone's actually going to go to that level, lots of people get rejected from someone that they ask out. I certainly did, and I didn't become a mass shooter. I mean, you probably have been, wanting to date somebody and they didn't want to date you back and you didn't become a mass shooter. There are definitely underlying psychological factors. And we talked about this in like the potential solutions, and that's kind of just the mental awareness issue as opposed to mental illness, about mental awareness education. What do you do to kind of, when people are feeling rejected from society, where is the support network for that? Because people talk about depression and they talk about even psychosis, but what do you do for things like rejection from society? We have things like anger management, but there's no rejection from society management. Alcoholics Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous, rejection from society anonymous. Where's the 12-step program from that? And if you think that that sounds silly, how many times have we talked about the commonalities in all of these different cases where like the person is rejected and they also feel sexually repressed, and many people don't grow out of it. They get a wife, they get children, and I mean, look at the countless examples we mentioned. Gary Ridgway, Andre Chikatilo, married with children. But the thing is, though, they can't escape the types of sexual tension that was, just the feelings of rejection that society placed on them in their childhood. Also, things like abuse and beatings, and that's very, very common. Physical abuse, especially from the parents, mind you, especially from the parents. That is kind of another consistent factor in what shapes someone into becoming a serial killer. And it is just something that is very, very nasty. But these things do indeed happen. And it's good that we can try and talk about where is culture really going wrong? Where is civilization going wrong? Where we have these types of individuals. So it's not only about kind of just discussing a step-by-step process of what they did to murder people. It's not only about the actions of murder. It's like, where do we go from here? Even just us as true crime, watchers and listeners, where do we go from here? And I think it's very important to have these discussions if we're going to follow up on anything associated with serial killers and some of the other criminals out there. But, it's like desire and an inability to control someone's desires. That's a big thing. And it's not only sexual. Once again, some people can just lust for power, and that really leads to things like definitely the serial killers who are also involved